Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for the next episode of our Get Certified SQL AI Developer series. My name is Anna. I'll be your producer for this session. I'm an event planner from Reactor, joining you from Redmond, Washington. Before we start, I do have some quick housekeeping. Please take a moment to read our code of conduct. We seek to provide a respectful environment for both our audience and presenters. While we absolutely encourage engagement in the chat, we ask that you please be mindful of your commentary, remain professional and on topic. Keep an eye on that chat. We'll be dropping helpful links and checking for questions for our presenters and moderators to answer live. Our session is being recorded. It will be available to view right here on the Reactor channel. With that, I'd love to turn it over to our speakers for today. Thank you both so much for joining.
Hello. G'day. Hello, everyone. How are you doing? I'm Martin, and I'm joined by Greg here on our SQL Developer Talk. We'll be going through the DP-800 exam, and hopefully you'll follow along great. Over to you, Greg.
Yeah, hi, Marty. And welcome, everyone. This is an interesting new exam, this one. I'm Greg. I'm based in Melbourne, Australia. And it is an exam I did a little while ago. And it's a sort of fascinating change to what's available because it's back to a SQL Server specific sort of exam, which we haven't had quite that in recent times. But in addition to that, it's got a whole bunch of coverage of the AI features that have appeared as part of SQL Server 2025 as well. And this is not the only session in this series. So this is the second for today, effectively. There was one earlier in the US. But in addition to that, there are some upcoming ones. So May 19th, there's Design and Develop SQL Solutions Like a Pro. And these ones, though, note, are early at Pacific time, and they don't currently have APAC times, but I've asked Fabric Pam about this, and I'm hoping maybe we can get some APAC ones as well. 21st, there's Secure, Optimize, and Ship SQL Solutions with Confidence. And then 26th is where the AI hits. And so we got Bring AI to SQL with Embeddings, Search, and RAG. And look, one of the things that's interesting with the AI content is you'll find that I've had a number of clients who've said to me, well, why am I worried about this yet? Or DBAs in particular saying, isn't this something that, I'm not going to see in my systems for quite some period of time? But there's this really interesting thing happening at the moment, whereas there is this CEO-led interest happening around AI things. And I've had a number of clients where they've come back to me and said, hey, our CEO went off to some conference and then came back asking all sorts of questions about AI and so on. And it's really important that you're able to have a sensible discussion about these things, because otherwise you just get sidelined. So it's important that you can contribute to those sort of conversations. In addition, we just want to throw in that there is a SQL panel. This one has appeared in recent times. There was, and still is, a Fabric panel. And these user panels, the idea is that you sign up for the user panel. And then what happens is you start getting a stream of emails every now and then that say, hey, here's this new thing that we're looking at doing, and do you want to participate in this? This is really interesting because people often say, I wish I had some knowledge of what's coming in the product. And they also will say, though, I wish I had a way to influence what's getting built in the product. And the beauty of these user panels is you just end up doing one-on-one, or in the case of the one I did yesterday, 4-on-1, but where I had a number of product group members. And then they're just sitting and showing me, like, for example, the sort of things that they're looking at building and a mock-up of how it might look. And then we get to discuss, how that would impact me and what I think about that. And they get to dive deeper into the areas. And so this is really interesting. And so the SQL people have started doing this now as well, because it was really successful with the Fabric one. And so there's a link there, aka MS Join SQL User Panel, if you want to sign up to get the invites. Now, when you get an invite, you can respond to it. You won't necessarily get invited into everyone, but obviously the higher quality contributions you're able to make and so on, you'll get more and more invitations. And in fact, if you still want to join the Fabric one, if you just changed the SQL in that link to Fabric, you'd also be able to join the Fabric user panel as well. Now, don't forget about joining your local user groups as well. So there are plenty of Azure Data user groups around. We've got pretty active ones in Melbourne that are good. In fact, there's a couple of groups. And the wonderful thing with those, I find, is that there's usually hybrid arrangements. And so I can either attend in person, or many of them offer hybrid options where I can attend online as well. And so regularly, I'll also attend ones out of Brisbane and other cities. And that's been really, really useful. But I think for anyone looking to build a career in the data areas, being part of the user groups is important. And in these series of things that have been organized, there's also a new Data Days event coming. And so people said they love Fabric Data Days so much. Well, it's coming back, and it's going to be bigger, but more importantly for us, SQL is going to be part of that. And Fabric Pam mentioned that there may be even some vouchers for the DP-800 exam as part of that event, but there's obviously no promises at this stage. In this session, don't forget the session is live and interactive, and we have moderators in the chat ready to answer your questions. And so the first of these is Deputy Guri, who's a fellow data platform MVP, both Marty and I are. And we've also got Jeff Shoemaker there as a Fabric community member. So tell us though, Marty, what are we going to be talking about today?
Okay, thanks for that, Greg. Great introduction. So today we're going to be talking all about the new DP-800 exam, which is currently in beta. So just before I go on any further, I see a couple of comments in the chat about, is this aimed at developers? Yeah, definitely is. SQL developer, if you're a SQL developer, DBA, T SQL person, whatever, you'll get value out of this. So drop us a note in the chat. Tell us where you're from. Tell us your background. Drop some comments. We got those great people standing by to answer your questions and engage in a chat with you. So back over to the exam. So the exam is in beta. So if you go take the exam, you're probably not going to get the marks straight away. You just have to wait till the exam goes live, what we call GA, generally available, and then you'll get your marks there. You also get the chance to comment on the questions in the exam, give feedback, because, you know, putting an exam out to the whole world, there's a range of people in there. They've got different experiences, different interpretations of the questions, and having that feedback makes the exam better for everyone all year round. So what topics will be covered in the exam? So we're going to start with an overview of the DP-800 exam. And there's three main areas on here, you know: design and develop database solutions. And the first two of these may seem, you know, things that have maybe been covered before. And the third one, implement AI capabilities, is the new one. But the implement AI capabilities kind of infuses into the other two, kind of infuses across the whole spectrum of the exam. I mean, you can implement AI features within it, SQL Server, and also use AI to develop things like your T SQL, Copilot, that sort of thing, to brush up on syntax, get it helps along. So you can help develop and incorporate both AI into your solution. So we've got three main areas there: design and develop, implement security and compliance. Now everyone's talking about security and compliance when they're not talking about AI at the minute. and obviously our AI solutions. And as AI becomes more mainstream, which it's doing, it's no longer a niche, it's mainstream, that gives us more challenges around the environments. So
it's probably worth throwing in with that comment earlier too. Is this a developer exam? This is much more a developer exam than the previous ones. And so you'll find a really strong focus on development topics and things. And if you look at even the existing SQL Server areas that are covered, there's a heavy focus on the developer side of that, which I love to see. But tell us about the certification.
Okay, so the certification, the Microsoft certification, the SQL AI developer exam. So developing AI-enabled databases, it is a new certification. It's only been out since March 2006, and it is currently in beta. So, like you say, Greg, great to have a developer exam. We used to have one just aimed at T SQL in general that was just kind of on-premise, but obviously now things have gone global, cloud-based, and it's great to see this exam come along. So we need to validate our skills, our SQL Server, Azure SQL, and SQL database in Fabric against our skills that we know already. Like I say, 3 big domains, and are kind of split evenly across the board. Design and develop, so 35-40% of the exam. Secure and deploy, compliance as well. So that's 35 to 40%. And AI capabilities, which rounds it off to about 25-30%. So a bit of an overlap between all of those. So, split evenly, not heavily weighted at one or the other. 100 minutes to pass the exam. And obviously the passing score is 700 out of 1,000. So good luck in the exam taking that. So the journey from foundations to intelligence. So like I say, this maps to 3 main areas that are aligned with different certification domains. So each one of them areas is known as a domain. So what have we got in design and develop database solutions? Now, clearly, one of the mainstays of SQL is tables, and that's a big part of it. So brush up on those tables. We've got different types of them. I actually struggled a little while back. I was trying to think of something really simple, like this. I think the syntax to name a constraint within a table. So something really simple like that. And I actually went and looked it up. So I went to the page that tells you all about how to create a table, which is probably very standard for most DBAs. And it was way longer than I thought. It was like all the things you can do with creating a table was in there. And I was like, oh, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. All I want to do is find out how to name a constraint. So obviously I did, but it did surprise me the amount of things that you could do just by creating a table. So obviously indexes, constraints, making sure, data or indexes and foreign keys line up. We got programmability, SPs, store procedures, functions and triggers, and they can be used to obviously call some of our AI stuff as well. Different T SQL patterns. We might have CTEs, views calling other views, good practices, maybe not so great practices, and AI assisted authoring tools, the likes of Copilot, which is now blended in to SQL Server Management Studio. So if you've got the latest version of that, which is SQL Server SQL Server Management Studio 22, you'll see it's built on the Visual Studio shell, the traditional Visual Studio shell, and it's got great interaction with Copilot. I was using it the other day. I was writing some case statements. A lot of the code was like case statements, and it was basically writing them for me. I was pressing the tab key, thinking, oh, I'll just accept what it is, and I'll go back and change it later. But I got it like basically correct first time. I was actually quite taken aback and surprised in a pleasant way. We got the middle one.
It really is quite impressive. Yeah, I had configured Copilot in Management Studio a while back, and recently the thing where it's doing the predictive stuff to suggest the code that you might be trying to write and so on. The first time it started doing that, it almost freaked me out a little bit, but I was used to it in Visual Studio and things in GitHub and so on. But when you start seeing that appear in Management Studio, it really was quite interesting. Like I'd make a call to a procedure and it already just started mapping out all of the parameter things that I might typically pass and so on. It was pretty impressive stuff, actually.
It is. It's a great time saver, Craig. But apart from that, it's also a good learning tool. You know, things come up that you might already have to look up, and obviously things come up that you don't really know about as well. And great learning tool to follow along as well. But the middle section is a huge section. We've got implement data security and compliance. So lots of our organizations nowadays, you know, they've got compliance, global compliance, national compliance, industry compliance over the top of them. And you want a good governance map over the top. So governance, not just about technical ability here, it's process, people, integrating, and all that sort of thing. Got performance tuning and optimization, and what goes on behind the scenes. How does SQL make a decision? We just tell it what we want and expect it to come up with the right way to do it, and mostly it does that. Sometimes it does it and gives us the right answer, but it's not quite as performance as it should be, and we might have to tweak. CI and CD within SQL projects. We've got SQL projects within Visual Studio Code, within Management Studio, within Visual Studio, and they help us deploy, take our code from development through test, through UAT, through production in a clear and concise manner. And basically, Azure integration and our deployments are a massive factor within this section. And then the new section. Implement AI capabilities. So integrating search. So more ways to search within SQL Server itself. You know, we don't just have to rely on where clauses, like statements. Yeah, like I was struggling now. That like statements. We've got now embeddings. So, you know, matching phrases, you know, so I might use the phrase, Greg and myself are performing our SQL performance here, or today Martin and Greg are doing a SQL presentation. So generally speaking, you wouldn't kind of match them up using traditional SQL, but using embeddings, you know, a mathematical formula to say those two sentences are very similar. They're both conveying the same sort of thing. And that's kind of something new that we've not really seen before, and definitely something that developers would want to go on and search with. What do you think of that, Greg?
Yeah, it's been really interesting building this out, and we'll talk more about search later. But I think it really changes the capabilities we've had in search. People always wanted tricky searches. Really, I mean they don't say that, but when you look at what people are looking for, they don't know what they want. And they want to use their own words, but they also want the results fast. And so we had some ability to do that with full text search, but this just takes it to another level entirely.
It certainly does, Greg. It certainly does. And then we've got the retrieval augmented generation. So, you know, your large language model has been trained on data, but you might want to augment it with additional knowledge that it needs to acquire in real time. But let's get into design and develop, our first point of view. So covers database objects, like we say, tables, data types. Getting your data types correct, obviously, I think most people watching this would know, is a really good thing to do. Lines them up with standards that have gone before and exist in the real world. Things like columns and indexes. Remember, we've got different types of indexes, not just our clustered and non-clustered. We've got XML indexes, column store indexes, and the like. On a similar note, we've also got specialized tables. You know, I've said before about the amount of documentation to do with creating a table. So we've got temporal tables that obviously sit behind tables, tell us what changed, and so on and so forth. But we've got in-memory tables. We've also got external tables. So you create a table within SQL Server that points at an external location, and exposes it as though it was a table within SQL Server itself, kind of like virtualizing the data. We've got graph tables in there, so we can use traditional T SQL syntax in different ways to query graphs within SQL Server. And then we've got ledger tables as well. So a whole range of different specialized tables that exist. Columns, JSON columns, and indexes for semi-structured data, like say XML indexes, indexes on JSON columns, and our traditional constraints, our primary keys, our foreign keys, our uniques, our check constraints, and our defaults, things that help us keep the data normalized and constrained so that if data's going in that's not meant to be going in, we know about it straight away. And then we've got sequences. Sequences is an interesting one to me, Greg. I grew up always using not defaults, auto numbers, and I see people still using them a lot rather than sequences. I don't know what you think of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually wrote an article for Simple Talk a little while ago where I was talking about identities versus sequences. The traditional thing in SQL Server is to use identity columns, but I tend to now use sequences all the time instead of identity columns. That's just a personal preference. And it's because everything I can do with an identity column, I can do with a sequence. But with a sequence, I can do much more than that as well. And there are places where sequences play nicely for me, but identity columns don't. So for example, if you've ever tried to insert one of these keys, for example, across a linked server, then you'd quickly find out that things like set identity insert on doesn't work across a linked server. But if I had used a sequence on the table, then I don't need to do that. And I have other ways of doing that sort of insert. So I find it's actually a richer story. And the other thing to be aware of with sequences, of course, is that I can use the same sequence on multiple tables. So I might have a car bookings table and a flight bookings table and a hotel bookings table, and they could all have the same booking ID by using sequences. So that's a sort of a powerful aspect of it as well. And it's also important to understand that with sequences, you can pre-allocate the numbers rather than having to do the insert into the table and then retrieve back the last value like we tend to do with identity columns. And so, yeah, they're one of my favorite things, Marty.
They are indeed. And like you've made a good note there, Greg, richer. So all of this T SQL stuff is making the database richer for us. We can query in richer ways. But let's move on to programmability. So obviously our programming objects encapsulate business objects inside the data layer. So things like our stored procedures, I guess that's the best example. We've got those views. They're abstract security. Well, they're not security objects, but they can limit the amount of data we get back. So that's an important point there. And they abstract things, but they're not really security objects. But we've also got scalar and table valued functions. I love table value functions. I don't know. As a developer, I don't know. This may be a good thing, a bad thing. I don't know. We see things and like they're great, and we might start using them a bit too much. And maybe I'm guilty of that with table value functions, but I really like them. So stored procedures, reusable. You can parameterize their operations. Triggers for automated responses to basically data changes. Be careful with the triggers. I think most people hopefully know that by now. They're great for responding to events. We've got other ways of responding to events now. But they do have an overhead. If you need them, you need them. My point of view with all code is really it should be as simple and performant as it can. That doesn't mean it can't be complicated. It can be. It just needs to be as simple as it probably can be. So like the objects that we mentioned there, they're foundational, for AI integration later. For example, you've got stored procedures that can call external endpoints. And in fact, any of these objects that we've talked about here can use code to call those external endpoints if they need to. So let's look at some advanced T SQL patterns. So things like common table expressions. One of the, the great things to do here is to make these readable. Very often, and I'm guilty of this myself, I'll write CTEs, I'll see CTEs that are like 3, 4, 5 layers deep, and they're really hard to read. And when you've looked at them in a bit more detail, you might be able to get that down to maybe 1 or 2, or do those things in more meaningful ways. So again, writing things simple, they don't have to be, overly complex. As simple as they can be. If they need to be complex, then they're complex, but as simple as they can be. What are some of the other advanced T SQL patterns we've got here? We've got window functions. Been in the product for a number of years now. Things like row number, pretty standard. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things. Ranking, leading, lagging. Leading and lagging are really good. I think I use them quite a bit. What was the row above, or 2 rows above, or 3 rows above? And remember, they're called window functions because you can write a window across the result set. So if you think of a result set as being one window, well, it doesn't have to be one window because we can partition it in different ways on different values. You could go up to the start of that window or the bottom of that window and do various operations on those values using lag and lead. We've got a variety of JSON functions, not only JSON, open JSON, JSON value. We've got JSON array arg, JSON array, and JSON object. One of the big things we've got here, Greg, and I think you might agree, this has been a big ask in the product, is regular expressions.
Yeah, well, it's probably, if you look at the reasons that people were using SQL CLR, the number one use case that people always came up with was regular expressions. And so now having that embedded as part of the normal language as built-in functions is a huge thing.
Yeah, it certainly is. It certainly is. I'm really glad to see it there. And I noticed comments around where obviously a lot of other people are glad to see that as well. And finally, we've got things like our graph queries using the match operator. We've got correlated queries. Error handling is great as well. Obviously, been in the product for a while. It's got better as time goes on. But having those routines to handle when things go wrong and take action or alert us or do whatever it is a great thing. But before we get into the next section, Greg, I just want to mention our AI-assisted authoring. So we've got Copilot powered code generation, obviously very similar to IntelliSense. What is coming next? How can we make our next piece of T SQL marry up with what we're doing quite well? And those suggestions from things like Management Studio generated by Copilot are fantastic time savers and also good learning tools. We've got things like, model context protocol coming in now. And tools and options in various Copilot chats. So the chat bar at the side of the window, you can chat to Copilot, ask about your data and that sort of things. There's lots of Copilot windows around, and to some degree that might be confusing, but it's kind of good to sit down and know that this Copilot window does that. This Copilot window might do something else, and so on and so forth. Connecting MCP servers to their various endpoints is something that probably people want to learn to do in a clear manner as well. Have MCP help us in various ways, whether it's Power BI, SQL Server, C#, whatever it is. So SQL Server and Fabric Lakehouses, you can do the same with that. And finally, I guess, understanding the security implications of these AI tools. So not just the tools themselves, will it expose your data in ways that you didn't think was necessary? So it just brings a different context to the security conversation. But I think that's a bit of a wrap up there for the introduction to the main 3 sections of the course, Greg. Can you tell us in a bit more detail about things we can expect?
Yeah, so that first section is very much the developer style things. The next section is sort of a bit of a mixture between developer and DBA side of things. So it's the secure, optimize, and deploy area. So there are things here you need to be comfortable with in the exam. So, for example, things like always encrypted. Understand that that's a client-side encryption for sensitive columns, and know that you're going to need to have keys that are stored and where they can be stored. That sort of thing is important. And we might use that so that the DBA can't see the plain text version of something, but also it's important so that if you have a hosting provider, they can't see the actual original text of some of these things. Understand how dynamic data masking works. And all that is it's able to hide values from unauthorized users. But this isn't encryption. This is just a form of obfuscation. I see people often quite confused because I think dynamic data masking is some sort of encryption. It's most certainly not. And the other thing to understand with that is make sure you know how the unmask command can be, or permission can be used, so that who can actually see the unmasked data. Row level security is another one in this area. And so that filters rows, but it's based on a function you create. So get comfortable with knowing how to create those functions and apply them as a policy, and so that you can use that to filter rows appropriately. And generally that function is going to be based somehow off the identity of the user. Make sure you get object level permissions. And in the case of SQL Server, that's very much things like column level permissions. And one of my favorites, of course, is managed identity. And this is where we're moving into a hybrid world. Instead of having just identities that are local to the machine, if you enroll your server in Azure Arc, or if we're dealing with Azure SQL Database, or if we're dealing with Azure SQL Managed Instances, or even Azure VMs that are running SQL Server, you have options to use managed identity. Now, the beauty of managed identity is you don't want to be managing usernames and passwords, and managed identity gets you around that. I often see people want to use service principals instead, and they might be used to that in GitHub and other areas. But the reason I don't love service principals is they expire. And so I'm always a bit nervous about embedding them in something, because to me, it feels a bit like a time bomb that one day in the future, it will suddenly not work anymore. Where a managed identity is managed by the Azure infrastructure, and it rolls over the passwords and it resets the credentials and so on, does a job of that all by itself in the background. But importantly, make sure you understand both system-assigned and user-assigned identities. A system-assigned identity is one that's just attached to a resource. And if you kill off the resource, then the system-assigned managed identity be gone. Where a user-assigned managed identity is one you create and then you associate it or assign it to a resource. And one of the beauties of this is you could assign the same identity to multiple resources. So if I had 4 web servers, I could assign the same identity to each one of them. And of course, when you get rid of the resources, the user-assigned managed identity lives on. Make sure you know how to configure auditing in the product and what it can and can't achieve. And if you've started to look at Data API Builder and its endpoints, make sure you know how to secure those. And that's all of the different types of endpoints. So you can have a REST endpoint, can have GraphQL endpoints, and it can have MCP endpoints. Now, in performance tuning and optimization, this is just good, solid, standard DBA and developer stuff. Query store is the main focus here. And so we use that to track query plans and performance over time, and to also detect regression. So if we have a query that was running great and then all of a sudden it's now running bad, and you go, look, wow, what on earth happened to me? Then you've got the ability to see the different query plans and what's occurred. But importantly, it also gives you easy ways to force a different plan to be used. Or you can look at a query plan and say, hey, that one was great. I want to go back to using that plan. Make sure you're comfortable with execution plans and working through those, and in particular, finding operators that are costly, the standard missing index things, and so on. Dynamic management views, make sure you're comfortable with all of the standard ones that are typically used. So if you look at, if I'm drilling into, I don't know, requests that are going on at the moment, there's a hierarchy with requests. And then under that, basically we have sessions. And then under that, we have connections and so on. Just make sure you know how all of those sort of fit together. And managing statistics is an important area for this, and also how we would do just general index tuning. And finally, with this one, there's also blocking and locking and blocking and deadlocks. Make sure you understand how they're detected and how they're resolved. I always think resolve is a sort of an interesting word, because in SQL Server, that means one of the processes involved is going to get killed. So I suppose that's sort of resolved. But now there's also CI/CD with SQL projects. And now SQL database projects have gone through a bit of a change in recent times. If you're used to the older, originally Datadude and VSTS style projects, there are now SDK style projects. And make sure you're comfortable with working with those for version controlling, schema definitions, and so on, but also in the different environments. And so while we can do that in, say, Visual Studio Code and so on, these things are also migrating into SQL Server Management Studio. And so you just keep an eye on exactly how that's working. And make sure you know how to do automated builds, how to compare schema changes over time, and importantly, how to detect schema drift, where we have a concept of what the database should look like, but for some reason, it doesn't actually look like that. And maybe someone went in and did a patch in the middle of the night to quickly get around some issue, but they didn't then make those changes go back into the development areas and so on. And so maybe our concept of what the schema looks like is not what it really looks like.
And Greg,
yes.
And Greg, so I guess it's as much about process there as the tooling?
Yes, completely. And the CI/CD pipelines as well, be a little bit comfortable with how that's done in GitHub. I mean, we tend to use Azure DevOps quite a bit, but I use GitHub for a number of different projects. But just try and be aware of at least what actions are in GitHub and how they're sort of used. There's database unit testing within that project framework, and probably for more modern things that you need to be aware of for the exam, get comfortable with the data API builder. It was an interesting thing that David A. Murray was helping build that out, and that's been going on for a number of years, and it's up to a really rich state now. You'll find people like Jerry Nixon and others sort of discussing this. There's plenty of content online. Get yourself comfortable with Data API Builder and how you can expose your SQL data using things like REST, GraphQL, and MCP endpoints, and the caching involved in that. There's also the options for Azure integration and deployment. Make sure you're comfortable with how to deploy SQL to Azure. So Azure SQL Database, Managed Instance, or SQL Server on Azure VMs. And then, of course, the SQL databases that we now have as an option in Microsoft Fabric, which are basically another version of an Azure SQL database that is a Fabric SQL database, where Fabric does a whole lot of the configuration and control for you. Be comfortable with hybrid architectural patterns, meaning how do we get from on-premises to cloud migration and so on, and get familiar with Azure Monitor and how that impacts with log analytics. because when you're in an Azure environment, that's the standard way that you need to be monitoring logs. And as I said, if you're dealing with managed identities, be comfy with those. But if you're not, know how to use Azure Key Vault for secure passwordless deployments. But the bigger news, of course, is the AI areas of this. And so, as I said, if you talk to users, they don't know what they want, but they want solid searches. And we've had approaches for doing this over the years. Full text search is something I've actually been a big fan of for a long time. And it lets you do keyword-based queries across large text columns. And importantly, it's actually really fast. It can be quite rich if you add things like synonyms and where we had a thesaurus and so on. Be aware the thesaurus doesn't work in Azure SQL database, but the synonyms and things do. But this allows us to go beyond that. So you can imagine with a large language model, if you've ever just even sat and chatted to ChatGPT or Copilot, you know you can have a sort of a higher level discussion with these things, and they understand the language. And so this sort of extends the search into semantic search. And so this helps us provide natural language interfaces that end up generating perhaps SQL for us, but have a different level of understanding to what we had before. So full text search matches words and synonyms and also different parts of words. So drive, driving, drove, it knows those sort of things. But semantic search matches the intent. And the foundation for that is being able to use vectors and hybrid search patterns. So the first thing you must know about in this is embeddings. And this is where we take a chunk of text, we send it to an AI model, and we get back a vector. So just a whole bunch of effectively float values that come back. And there's now a native vector data type in SQL Server that allows us to store high dimensional embeddings directly. There are a bunch of vector related functions have been added as well, so get comfortable with those. Vector distance in particular allows us to compare the two sets of values and look at what the distance is between them in terms of similarity. That's often used, of course, where we look at the distance basically in top 10 or top 20 style queries. Make sure you're a bit comfortable too with chunking strategies. There are limits on the size of text we can send up to do embedding. And so if you're going to break it up, you've got to look at the strategies that are used for that and how to do that sensibly. SQL Server's now got an AI generate chunks style functions as well. But understand nearest neighbor searches and when you use those. So things like KNN is K nearest neighbors. This gives us exact, highly accurate search results. But that can be slow on large amounts of data, where approximate nearest neighbor sort of sacrifices perfection, but it gives us massive speed improvements. So it's ideal for large-scale real-time vector search. And they also talk about ENN, which is exact nearest neighbors, where effectively we go through and check every single value, but that just takes forever. So you need to be comfortable with where do I use filtering in a query as opposed to where do I use vector search. So the answer is not to use vector search for everything. It's more for the sort of fine tuning, but you want to make sure you get the bulk work done with the filtering. And also then we have RAG. And so this is Retrieval Augmented Generation. You can imagine that a large language model was trained on information some time back, and it also doesn't know the specifics of what's going on in your organization. So Retrieval Augmented Generation says, let's fix that by taking local information and including that as part of the context in what gets sent to the language model, And then that can all then give you a much more meaningful answer, but tied to your local business thing. So you get the richness of the LLM style query, but you get the relevant context from your business. Now, in SQL Server 2025, there's a call, SP invoke external REST endpoint. Make sure you're comfortable with how to use that. But we can use that to call Azure OpenAI and other models. But generally what we do is there is now a command called create external model, and that allows you to sort of pre-configure a whole lot of those things. And then there are functions like AI generate embeddings and so on. Get comfortable with how they work. They've really made it dramatically simpler in SQL Server 2025 for this. And of course, this is all based over the top of JSON, so you need to be comfortable with that. At my blog, you'll often find I write a bit about this sort of thing as well. So that's at blog.greglow.com. But Marty, what's the best way to prepare for the exam?
Okay, so I think this is not really about, well, it is obviously about preparing for the DP-800 exam, but it's as much about preparing for any exam, just general tips. I guess the thing that sets this apart is it's pretty new. It hasn't been out in the wild that long, so I'm guessing you're not going to know too many people who've took the exam and are willing to offer advice or insight into what was there. But what's the best way to go about it? I think, like, set yourself a target, schedule the exam. For example, if I was going to go in today, maybe I'd say, okay, I've got a month. I'll set the exam date for a month down the track, and that gives me time to get a study plan and stick to it for that month, get up to speed, and then take the exam. But how do I know that I'm going to be ready for the exam? Hopefully, I've reviewed the study guide. I've looked for other resources, other prep resources, and I've got the practice test when it's available. I don't think it's actually available right at the minute, the DP-800 one, but certainly it'll be coming. Every single Microsoft exam has got a practice test available online that you can go and take, but don't rely solely on the practice test. Obviously,
yeah, absolutely, Marty, too. It's something I really want to call out is that the practice tests are all just simple multiple choice questions, and that's not an indication of what you'll strike in the exam. You'll get a rich set of different question types in the exam itself.
That's right, Greg, that's right. And also just completing the Microsoft Learn modules. So for anyone, obviously people watching this are probably up to speed with a lot of SQL as well. And some of this Learn content might be just recapping what you already know, but go through it. Obviously maybe skim over the bits that you think you're already familiar with, but hidden inside there's going to be other bits, other gems that you're probably not that familiar with, or you just need a refresher on. So do go through that Learn content and just absorb it all. And that
I might throw in too, Marty, if you Google my name or Bing my name and Simple Talk, I've recently written 3 articles. One is on how to prepare, one is on how to take these sort of exams, and I've also got one there on common misconceptions about these sort of exams. There is a technique to effectively taking these types of exams.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things about the beta exam is as well, you're obviously gonna have time to give feedback. And if you give feedback, make it kind of meaningful. Why did you think this question was not appropriate? Don't just say like it was too hard. That's like useless advice. Was it phrased differently? Did you interpret it differently? Do you think it's not relevant? Some sort of way of saying like it's based on this. I
also can't stress enough the thing about getting hands-on experience with this. I see many people who go and try these exams and they just haven't had hands-on experience, and that really shows through with the sort of things where they just can't work out what's going on. And it's because, it's one thing learning something, but then if someone asks you something a bit different to what you learned, then if you don't have that hands-on experience to sort of remember what it is you saw when you did that, you really are putting yourself at a severe disadvantage.
Yeah, exactly. And, you just come up with a little side project maybe to experiment with these things. Give you a bit of an idea of something that I had to get me up to speed on the vector embeddings and that. I was inputting a lot of spreadsheets with around about the same columns, but they were all worded slightly differently. They kind of all meant the same thing, but they were different. So I used some of the vector embedding and the vector stuff to try and match up what columns matched other columns and what words matched other words. And I was relatively successful. We're all learning at this, but you can think of something up yourself, relatively simple to get on with things like that. But we're coming to the end, so let's wrap this up, Greg. We've got our Getting Certified series, all about the AI developer. This is obviously the first one, or the second, but the first one was this morning, US time. We've got other things, design and develop, optimize, ship, and preparing for exam day. That's a big one. But remember, the product roadmap is available. You can join the SQL panel, and like Greg said at the start, giving feedback and getting to know the direction of things is a big help to the product team, and is also probably a big help to yourself as well. But
it's actually really great. Don't underestimate how great it is to have an understanding of what the team were thinking when they build particular features.
Yeah, absolutely, Greg. Absolutely. But as well as the product roadmap, we've also got the Azure Data Group. So Greg obviously is in Melbourne. He talked about the Melbourne groups. I run one with another MVP, Warwick, here in Brisbane. We do that virtually. And the thing about the virtual groups is that they're probably at good time zones for, well, in my case in Brisbane, for people in America or people in Singapore. So 6 hours either side of your time zone is pretty good. So keep your eye out for them, get involved, and have fun. But we've got our data days as well, Greg. They're coming up very shortly. We'll be talking about developer experiences within SQL Server, Azure SQL, Fabric SQL, all that SQL family. So going bigger and better than ever, and you don't want to miss it. So you can find out more about them at aka.ms.datadays. But I think that kind of brings us up to, before we go, we do have to thank our moderators. That is a good call, Greg. So me and Greg get to do the easy bit. We get to present. The people in the chat, well, they get to answer questions, and sometimes they get a lot of questions. If they haven't got to them, I'm sure they will. I've seen a few come through, and our moderators have been on top of them. But you've done moderating, Greg. How do you find moderating to presenting?
Yes, it's quite a different experience, actually. It can be kind of busy sometimes or quiet other times, a bit hit and miss, hard to know. In fact, one of the things I have coming up, I've been learning Mandarin for a long time, and I'm going to have my first attempt at moderating in Chinese coming up soon. So I'll see how I go with that.
I think it'd be great, Greg. I've seen some of your Chinese conversations, and I don't know Chinese at all, but you seem to know what you're talking about, and the other person seemed to know what you were talking about too.
Yeah, so more importantly, yeah.
All right, so let's wrap this up. And I've had a great time presenting. Hopefully you have too, Greg. So I'll say
awesome. Look, we know there are plenty of other things you could have been doing at this same time. So look, thank you so much for being here with us.
Yep, thanks a lot. Tune in
and
later.
Good luck with the exam.
Great stuff. See you later.
Thank you all for joining, and thanks again to our speakers. This session is part of a series. To register for future shows and watch past episodes on demand, you can follow the link on the screen or in the chat. We're always looking to improve our sessions and your experience. If you have any feedback for us, we would love to hear what you have to say. You can find that link on the screen or in the chat. And we'll see you at the next one.